All right, welcome to today's verdict, where legal issues meet real-world consequences. Coming up, as climate change accelerates, a critical environmental law is under threat. Could weaker protections put New York communities at risk? And earlier this year, the CURB Act promised big changes for NYPD policing. Did it deliver? Well, we'll take a look back. As you can see, we have much to get to, so stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. All right, hello, welcome to today's verdict, the interactive show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesh. Well, today's verdict is always encouraging you to stay connected. Make sure to tweet me at David Lesh and hashtag Ask Today's Verdict if you have a question. And check us out at BronxNet.tv. Now, when it comes to protecting our communities from pollution, irresponsible development, and environmental harm, few laws have been more impactful than NYPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. For over 50 years, NYPA has required federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their actions before moving forward. But now, those critical protections could be under threat. So what does that mean for New York, and why should we all be paying attention? Well, joining us now is Cecilia Ellis, Policy and Communications Manager at NYPIRG, to explain what's at stake and why we can't afford to roll back environmental safeguards. Cecilia, it's so nice to see you here today.
Thank you for having me.
I think this is a fascinating topic. It's about rolling back protections that are really meant to help New Yorkers generally. Let's start from the beginning a little bit here. Let's talk about that act itself. What is that act? I know I gave it an acronym. What does it mean in layperson's language?
Sure. So the National Environmental Policy Act has been around, like you said, for 50 years. It is a bedrock bipartisan law that seeks to protect people from environmental harm and protect the environment. So what that means is that really came out of a time of really unregulated pollution and development and climate.
And when was that? Like when
the 60s, right? Okay. So this was 69, 70 when they said that we need to do something different. We need to make sure that this doesn't continue.
All right. And one of those things is the applying for a permit if you want to push through some type of something that may affect the environment. Am I correct?
Right.
So what would that be? That would be, I think we were talking about this a little bit off camera, that would be like a nuclear facility or a highway or anything that would affect the environment?
Correct, yeah, anything, infrastructure, energy, transportation, land use, all of these things that potentially have the ability to pollute the land or air or impact our water negatively.
Is it a federal act or is this a New York act?
This is a federal act, so it's from the federal level. At the same time, it was created with the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and those types of things have led to New York's really high water quality standards that have allowed us to be protected from harmful projects like pipelines and power plants and fracking across the state.
Okay. Let's say I was a CEO of a company and I want to streamline something along. So I need a permit.
Yeah.
Right? Where would I, before we talk about what's really happening, in the past, what would I usually do?
Well, you would have to apply through the Department of Environmental Conservation. You'd have to go through the state's agencies and go through an environmental review process to determine, that agency would look at this project and proposal and determine what would its impacts be on the community where it would be placed. So we would see what toxic chemicals could be.
Let's say fracking, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So with pipelines, and fracking, they have the ability to leak toxic chemicals and pollute our air with greenhouse gas emissions. And you have to look at where these projects are being placed as well and consider the environmental justice impact.
And generally, how long would this usually take?
Well, I'm not sure historically how long this takes, but we do have data that in New York right now it's taking about 18 months, which is not that long.
Right. You're okay with that?
That's ultimately, especially with the Office of Renewable Energy Siting says that is how long it takes to get renewable energy projects permitted in the state of New York. And that's this is an important process that we don't want to weaken. We want to make sure that it stays strong so that people are we're considering the environmental impact before projects get approved, whether they're renewable energy or fracked gas.
Now, but have there been complaints over the last couple of decades that somebody couldn't get their permits fast enough? I mean, what was the impetus for all of a sudden weakening this particular act?
Well, we particularly decided to come together to take this action with our letter to Congress because we're concerned with the permit reform conversation that's been happening, especially in the last several years at the federal level. Ultimately, folks believe that we need to make the permitting process more easy for permits to get approved, and that they should be easier and shorter and rather than protective.
Now let's talk about permit reform. By the way, there's a concept of pay to play, which just so the viewers understand, that's when you're paying for something and getting something in return. Okay, that's
right.
The commonly known the term pay to play. How is that impacting this particular act, the pay to play?
So in H.R. 1, which passed this summer, they included what we call a pay-to-play aspect because ultimately it now rewrites the National Environmental Policy Regulations and says that if you pay a fee, you can get a shorter expedited environmental review process, regardless of whether that review process, goes through the proper, public comment periods and considers, whether that's enough time to consider the full impact of the project.
Funny. Well, I don't know if you would say it's funny, but it's literally what's happening politically throughout our entire society is if you put the money up, you'll get things done faster. And that seems to be how the administration, at least federally, seems to be thinking. It's raising money for the United States in some respects, whether it's tariffs or whatever you want to say. But what are we sacrificing by getting things to move along faster, right?
Public health, yeah. We're sacrificing people's access to safe, clean drinking water, access to clean air. There's a reason why we have these laws to protect us, and we don't want to go back to the time before we had environmental protections, especially in New York when we have the climate law that we need to be reaching.
What does it look like in terms of the timetable that they're trying to narrow down how long it takes to get a permit? From 18 months to what? To a year, to 6 months? What are they looking at?
Yeah, so they're looking at, it depends on the type of review, but down to a year or 2 years in order to, promote development, right, and promote growth. But, we could see public comment windows, which sometimes are as low as 20 to 45 days and that's not enough time to inform people about what's happening and allow them to come to a town hall or come to an event and speak out.
So how is your organization trying to change this new policy of speeding up the process of getting a permit?
Yeah, so at NYPIRG, we came together and worked with several other groups to write this letter to Congress, got over 100 groups from all across the state of New York to sign on in support of defending these environmental laws and protections that we've had for so long, bedrock, bipartisan, non-controversial protective laws. And we see that as extremely important that our New York State congressional representatives stand up for us and stand up for the environment and our health.
And are they?
Well, some are. We've had conversations. There are Congress people who have spoken out on the topic of pipelines currently being in discussion with the Williams Northeast Supply Enhancement Pipeline.
Let's tell the viewers about that. What does this pipeline mean?
Yeah, so the Williams-Nessie or Northeast Supply Enhancement Pipeline is a fracked gas pipeline that would be buried in the ocean off of Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Long Island and Queens. And New York banned fracking many years ago, and we know that we don't want any more pollution from fracked gas infrastructure and fossil fuel infrastructure. And so this specific pipeline has applied for water quality permits several times already and been rejected for having a negative impact on our water quality standards and not complying with New York law. And yet they continue to reapply for permits. And the only thing that's different this time around is that we have a different political climate. So it's not a permitting problem, it's a political problem.
That's not unusual. It happens all the time. So. And it's not just you, it's everybody who is fighting a more right agenda as opposed to a much more left agenda. what can you do under this administration, whoever knows how long this administration is going to be around, to possibly prevent the inroads into that act? Like, what's your best means? Is it going out to the public and knocking door to door and saying you can't let this happen? You can have dirty water. Like, what's the gameplay here?
I mean, that is something that we are doing. NYPIRG is doing all across the state, and you can absolutely do that. And you can also just start by looking up who your congressional representative is and reaching out to them and asking what they're doing to protect environmental law. This is a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue. Water quality matters to everyone. Clean air is important.
You say it's a bipartisan issue, but unfortunately, a lot of people on the right don't think it's bipartisan. What they want to do is they want to steamroll the process so they can get things done quicker and avoid the red tape. But that's not necessarily a bipartisan issue, because your particular side of the fence is like, look, why am I sacrificing expediency for the fact that, what am I sacrificing? The healthy water? Am I correct?
Exactly. Yeah, we don't want to trade water and our health and our access to clean air and the future of our planet in exchange for corporate profit.
I guess what I'm saying is I wish it was bipartisan.
Well,
it just doesn't seem to be as bipartisan as you and I might like it to be.
It did come from President Nixon, so.
At one time, a Republican administration.
Right.
But things just, they're just a pendulum. They swing back and forth and back and forth. All right, somebody's watching today, and they're a little nervous that, things are going to be streamrolled right past them, and they're not going to be in such a safe community. What would you tell them?
Well,
not to fear? What would you say?
Yeah, not to fear, but organize. I mean, what gives me hope is all of the conversations I have with folks, all of the organizations that I spoke with to sign this letter, and all the conversations I have with Congress members, like the ones we have here in New York, who like Jeffries and Nadler and Velasquez and Bronx's own AOC and my rep as well, who do want to champion environmental protections and signed a letter against the Williams pipeline to extend public comment period. And so what I would say is call Governor Hochul and tell her that you are concerned. And
I mean, it's a tough political environment, and
yeah.
you're like pushing a rock uphill.
Always.
But unfortunately, that's the way it works in politics. Tell me a little bit, Leslie, about your organization. How do we find it? Where do we get it? Where do we find you?
So you can find NYPIRG at nypirg.org, as well as on social media, X, Blue Sky, Instagram at NYPIRG. We are a statewide nonprofit. We work with college students on campuses all across the state to teach them grassroots organizing, as well as environmental issues and higher education affordability and the intersection of a bunch of different public health issues and things like that.
Well, personally, I agree with you. I think everybody bipartisan should want a healthy environment. How we get there, well, that's for another day. But you'll come back, and maybe we could talk a little bit about it.
I would love to.
All right, wonderful. All right, well, don't go anywhere, because today's verdict will be back right after this.
There's a new channel to explore, and it's bringing the classics back to life. During the day, relive the BronxNet originals that sparked conversations and built community. At night, dive into the hip-hop throwbacks that defined the generation. One destination, two powerful lineups. Now playing on Optimum Channel 952, Fios 2138, and streaming at BronxNet.tv. BX Legacy, where history meets the moment.
We are the Eco Leaders. We learned that everything starts with ourselves. Then we have to educate ourselves. Then we have to build community and use our imagination.
right, we're taking a look back at an interview from earlier this year in March when a proposal called the NYPD CURB Act was gaining traction in New York. The bill aimed to restrict stop-and-frisk tactics, address racial profiling, and improve policy community relations. Well, at the time, the big question was, would the CURB Act reshape policing in New York? Well, let's take a look. Let's introduce yourselves so we know who you are.
My name is Isabel Leyva. I'm a senior organizer at the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I work on the CURB Act campaign and policing issues across the city.
And I'm Michael Szycki. I'm the assistant policy director here at the New York Civil Liberties Union.
All right. Well, let's start with the CURB Act itself. Either one doesn't matter. Please describe for me what the CURB Act is.
Sure. So I can start. The CURB Act is legislation that would put an end to the abuses of the Strategic Response Group, which is a unit that has gained infamy for its deployment at and brutality at protests by preventing the NYPD from deploying it to protest activity or just renaming the unit and deploying a future unit that's pretty much the same thing to protest going forward. But more broadly, it also would impose restrictions on the most abusive tactics that we've seen the NYPD deploy at protests. So things like kettling and trapping people in an area where they can't leave to facilitate a mass arrest. The indiscriminate use of pepper spray on protesters as crowd control, shoving bicycles against crowds of people to push them back, which is something we've seen happen a lot. It's getting a handle on those abusive tactics and saying no more.
So is it the tactics that's the issue, or is it just the department that's the issue? In other words, what if we kept the department and we just changed the tactics? Which one is it, or is it both?
Well, the SRG was only created in 2015. It's a very new unit. And the problems with the SRG, which are extremely high levels of misconduct, racial bias, brutality, and the militarization of this unit are really inherent to what the SRG actually is. And this unit carries no unique function that is not already covered by other units in the NYPD outside of policing protest. So when folks raise the concern about removing the SRG from protests, interfering with the NYPD's ability to handle crime, the two things actually aren't related. And if the concern is the NYPD being able to handle crime, then that's even more of a reason to remove this militarized unit from protest activity.
Does the Michael, let me ask you a question. The militarized unit itself, does it portray some type of strength that makes the community a little bit wary? What is it doing mentally to the people who see this group come out at the rallies?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, the SRG, in their own training materials, they are basically sent in. They were originally billed as a counterterrorism unit. And that there was an initial promise from the police department that they wouldn't deploy them at protests, but they ended up actually using them mainly for that. And they are there really as a show of force from the NYPD. They're trained to use really aggressive tactics against specifically Black Lives Matter protesters, against racial justice protesters. It's kind of baked in that they think that they need this stronger militarized response to groups that they are viewing as kind of deserving of kind of special aggressive tactics. And the problem is when you send in that unit, what they end up doing is, actually escalating the encounter on their own. When they send in that militarized unit, it's not even because they're necessarily responding to any kind of protest or demonstration that is posing any real threat. It's the officers coming in from the SRG with that military equipment, with their hyper-aggressive tactics, with their bias training that is actually making the situation worse. They bring force, they bring violence, and they often are the reason why protests escalate and why we see the kind of chaos that can unfold when NYPD is showing up with this unit.
Isabel, I'm going to put on my other hat for a second. I'm going to take the other side here. There are many protests where the protesters don't disperse, where the protesters refuse to leave. Colombia, for instance, which has been happening with the pro-Palestinian protesters. What are you supposed to do when they won't stand up and leave the area so that people can get to school and get to their classes? Tell me, what other recourse do we have but a special unit to possibly use more force? Isabel?
The strategic The strategic response group is not unique in its ability to arrest protesters for being somewhere that they are not supposed to be. The NYPD was perfectly capable of policing protests prior to the SRG's existence. This unit went from a $13 million unit to a $133 million unit with no accountability, no oversight. The reality is that removing the SRG from protests will not have an impact on the NYPD's ability to police protests because protests are policed weekly in New York City where the SRG does not show up simply because the NYPD does not see the subject matter of a protest as an issue. So this really is about sending a militarized unit to exercise undue force on nonviolent protesters. And as someone who's documented police conduct at more than 400 protests since 2020, that is what we see. We do not see the SRG coming in to save the day. We see the SRG coming in and causing injury and causing chaos.
Well, Michael, let me ask you quick. Let's talk about saving the day. Have you ever seen any protests throughout New York that you'd like to see somebody come in and save the day because it doesn't look like this peaceful protest is so peaceful?
I think the issue is we've not seen the SRG actually fulfill the role that the NYPD claims that it is, which is about responding to protests in a way that is supposed to facilitate our expression of our First Amendment values and ability to express our views on political issues. We've seen the SRG, we've seen this unit, we've seen it deployed in ways that are actually directly in contravention of our core First Amendment values and rights. And it's just not been a success story here. This is a unit that has been found to be at the center of some of the worst abuses that we've seen at protests. It was the subject of a Human Rights Watch investigation from the 2020 protests that found that they were a core reason why the protests in Mott Haven escalated the way that they did. And that protesters, journalists, people who were convening nonviolently to protest, to demonstrate, to call out for reform in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the SRG was a core reason why those protesters were subject to abuse, why their First Amendment rights were violated. This is not a unit that has any business policing protest. The NYPD first, they seemed to recognize that at one point in 2015 when they said, actually, don't worry, we won't deploy this at protests. They have gone back on that promise, and we've seen the result of that walk back, which is the abuse of New Yorkers' First Amendment rights.
Isabel, let's get back to the issue of compromise and whether or not we could keep this group and somehow limit their tactics. If that's even possible, I'm not quite sure. But let's say it is. Which tactics would you limit?
I mean, the tactics that are outlined in the bill are the tactics that are most used by the SRG. So like Michael mentioned, kettling, use of pepper spray, use of sound devices, use of bicycles as weapons. But when we talk about compromise, that really doesn't apply here. Because if we remove the tactics of the SRG, they will be like every other cop at a protest. And that's the whole point, right? The SRG brings a different level of escalation and has this long history of violence. New Yorkers are traumatized by this unit. When we launched this campaign,
let me just stop you for a second. New Yorkers are traumatized by the unit, but New Yorkers are also traumatized by the crime and the fear many of us have throughout the city because of many protests. So how do you respond to those particular individuals that is looking for some strength to feel like they're not afraid to walk down Columbia's campus, let's say?
Well, I think that using Columbia as a very specific example and painting the entire city with that brush as if there are riots in our streets is simply not congruous with reality. And I think what I would say to those people is that fear is real. Everyone wants to feel safe, and the SRG does not keep us safe. Even when the SRG comes in and arrests people that some people might think should be arrested, they do not do it in a safe way. They have often involved pedestrians that are simply just walking by. And this unit is a militarized unit that is not just deployed to protest, but can come to your community if the NYPD sees fit. They do not belong on our streets, regardless of New Yorkers' desire to not want to have to engage with protests in our communities. There are other ways that we can handle that do not require the SRG.
Well, that's really what it comes down to. Michael, the pulse of New York right now, and I don't know if you feel it, but I certainly do, it's just a fear of disorder. and maybe we're swinging too far the other way, right, with these types of groups. Is there one particular, solution that you think you could give without moving all the way to the left? Is there something that you think you could put out on air that might be a solution that we could all get behind?
The only word so simple as just one thing, but I think the people's perceptions are grounded in their lived experiences, what they're seeing, and I don't want to discount people's perceptions, but you also do have to look at the actual data on what the realities are, and do policy that is actually based on what reality actually is, which shows us that crime has been on the decline in recent years, and that the vibes are not really matching that. But what you do is not really double down on the tactics that are proven in the past to actually just increase mass incarceration, and not deliver any real solutions. What you actually need to do is the harder work of looking at where we're investing in actually cutting off the root causes of why people are seeing and perceiving disorder. Is it that they have seen someone who is unhoused, who is sleeping on the subway, and it makes them feel uncomfortable? The solution there is not to send police after them. It's to actually figure out how we can get them into permanent, affordable housing, get them the supports that they need. It's the harder work of actually looking at what are the root causes that are driving people's perceptions about disorder, about crime that's leading to that situation, and cutting it off there rather than just a back-end approach of policing, which, sure, it might remove someone from a community for a particular, send them to Rikers and funnel them into a world of horrible injustices there, but it's not actually solving the core problem, and that's what our lawmakers should be focusing on.
All right. Well, listen, I'm always looking for a happy medium, somewhere where the subway riders can feel safe. At the same time, the person who is not doing particularly well on the subway is getting the mental health treatment that they need. So there's never an easy answer to any of these types of things. But I want to thank you both for coming on and discussing the issue, because I think it's important for New Yorkers to know. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, and of course you, the viewers, for watching. If you missed any part of today's show, be sure to check it out at YouTube. Also, remember, if there's a legal issue or topic you'd like to see in a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to contact me at davidlesh@bronxnet.org or tweet me at davidlesh, and make sure to hashtag Today's Verdict. From myself and all of us at Today's Verdict, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach a verdict. I'm David Lesh, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks with an all-new episode of Today's Verdict right here on BronxNet. You take care.